The black cleaning lady's daughter answered the phone and saved the owner from a fake contract. The elevator hummed quietly as it climbed to the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower, carrying two figures through the darkness of the sleeping city below. 12-year-old Tia Johnson pressed her face against the cold glass, watching the scattered lights of cars moving like fireflies through the empty streets. It was nearly midnight, and most people her age were fast asleep, but Tia had grown accustomed to these late-night adventures with her mother. "Remember what I told you about staying close?" Mrs. Evelyn Johnson whispered, adjusting the heavy cleaning cart beside them. Her voice carried the gentle authority that came from years of balancing motherhood with the demanding schedule of a professional cleaner. She wore her navy blue uniform with pride, each crease perfectly pressed despite the late hour. The elevator dinged softly, and the doors slid open to reveal the executive floor of Hale Industries. Tia's eyes widened as they stepped into what felt like a palace made of marble and glass. The hallway stretched before them like something from a movie, with oil paintings lining the walls and crystal chandeliers casting elegant shadows across the polished floors. "Mama, this place is incredible," Tia breathed, her sneakers squeaking softly against the pristine marble. She had been here twice before, but the grandeur never failed to amaze her. Mrs. Johnson smiled at her daughter's wonder while pulling on her rubber gloves. "Mr. Hale works very hard to maintain all this. That's why we need to make sure everything is perfect for him in the morning." She began unpacking her supplies with practiced efficiency: microfiber cloths, specialized cleaners, and a vacuum so quiet it wouldn't wake anyone in the neighboring offices. Tia had been accompanying her mother on these cleaning shifts for the past month, ever since her babysitter moved away and Mrs. Johnson couldn't afford a new one. What started as a necessity had become something Tia secretly looked forward to. There was something magical about having an entire corporate kingdom to themselves, moving through the empty halls like guardian spirits of the night. "Can I dust the conference room tonight?" Tia asked, already knowing the answer. Her mother had taught her the proper techniques, and Tia took pride in her work, treating each task like a mission to be completed with precision. "Of course, sweetheart. But remember to be extra careful around the electronics." Mrs. Johnson's voice carried the warmth of a mother who saw her daughter's eagerness to help as both endearing and admirable. As they began their routine, Tia found herself drawn to the corner office at the end of the hall. Through the glass walls, she could see the imposing desk of CEO Richard Hale, a man she had never met, but whose presence seemed to fill the room even in his absence. The office was a study in controlled chaos: neat stacks of documents organized with military precision, multiple computer monitors dark and waiting, and walls lined with awards and photographs of handshakes with important-looking people. Mrs. Johnson noticed her daughter's fascination. "Mr. Hale is a very important man, Tia. He makes decisions that affect thousands of people every day. That's a heavy responsibility for anyone to carry." Tia nodded, but her curiosity only deepened. She had always been fascinated by numbers and papers, often helping her mother organize bills and budget their household expenses. The sight of all those important documents made her mind race with questions about what kind of decisions happened in a place like this. After an hour of methodical cleaning, Mrs. Johnson wheeled her cart toward the elevator to refill her water buckets. "I'll be right back, honey. Keep dusting the conference room, and don't wander off." But as soon as her mother disappeared around the corner, Tia felt an irresistible pull toward Mr. Hale's office. She told herself she would just peek inside, maybe dust a few surfaces to surprise her mother with extra work completed. The office door was unlocked, and Tia slipped inside like a detective entering a crime scene. The room smelled of expensive leather and coffee, with just a hint of cologne lingering in the air. Her eyes immediately went to the massive oak desk, where papers were arranged in neat piles that seemed to tell stories of million-dollar deals and corporate strategies. One document in particular caught her attention, a contract lying open in the center of the desk, as if waiting for someone to sign it. The paper was thick and official-looking, with legal language that made Tia's head spin. But what really drew her eye was a bright yellow sticky note attached to the top corner that read, "Urgent, authorized payment by midnight, $32 million. Tia's heart began to race. $3.2 million. She had never seen so many zeros written on a single piece of paper. At home, she and her mother celebrated when they had enough left over at the end of the month to buy a pizza. This single document represented more money than her family would see in several lifetimes. She leaned closer, trying to make sense of the dense legal text. Most of it was incomprehensible, filled with phrases like, "whereas the party of the first part," and "subject to the aforementioned stipulations." But as someone who had learned to read contracts carefully, even simple ones like apartment leases and utility agreements, she noticed something that made her frown. The signature line at the bottom was blank, waiting for Mr. Hale's authorization. But more importantly, there was something about the company name listed as the recipient that seemed wrong. It was called Global Infrastructure Solutions LLC, which sounded official enough, but the address listed was just a P.O. box number. Tia remembered her mother warning her about scams that used official-sounding names but had no real addresses. As she studied the document more carefully, her trained eye, sharpened by months of helping her mother navigate the predatory world of utility companies and door-to-door salespeople, began to pick up on other subtle warning signs. The urgency of the midnight deadline, the vague description of services, and the fact that such a massive payment was being authorized outside of normal business hours. Tia felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the office's air conditioning. Something about this entire situation felt wrong, like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together. She glanced at the clock on the wall, 11:47 p.m. If this document was legitimate, Mr. Hale had only 13 minutes to sign it. The sound of her mother's cart rolling back down the hallway snapped Tia out of her thoughts. She quickly stepped back from the desk, her mind racing with questions and concerns she wasn't sure how to voice. As she rejoined her mother in the conference room, Tia couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled upon something much bigger than a simple late-night cleaning shift. "You look like you've seen a ghost, baby," Mrs. Johnson observed, noticing her daughter's troubled expression. Tia forced a smile, not wanting to worry her mother or admit she had been snooping where she didn't belong. "Just tired, Mama. It's been a long day." But as they continued their work, Tia kept glancing toward Mr. Hale's office, her mind turning over the details of that contract like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. She had learned from her mother that sometimes the most important moments in life come disguised as ordinary ones, and something deep in her gut told her this was one of those moments. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward midnight, and Tia found herself hoping that Mr. Hale would not come in tonight to sign that document. Because if he did, and if her suspicions were correct, she might be the only person in the world positioned to prevent what could be a very expensive mistake. At exactly 11:52 p.m., the elevator chimed, and heavy footsteps echoed through the marble hallway. Richard Hale stepped onto the 42nd floor looking like a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and his graying hair disheveled from running his hands through it countless times throughout the day. Tia and her mother froze in the conference room, listening to the approaching footsteps. Mrs. Johnson quickly signaled for Tia to stay quiet and continue working, while she herself moved to dust the far corner, making herself as invisible as possible. They had encountered Mr. Hale during late-night cleaning sessions before, and he had always been polite but distant, acknowledging their presence with a brief nod before disappearing into his office. Richard barely noticed the cleaning staff as he stumbled toward his office, his mind consumed by the 18-hour marathon of crisis management he had just endured. 3 major deals had fallen through that afternoon, his biggest client had threatened to pull their contract, and the board was breathing down his neck about quarterly projections that looked increasingly impossible to meet. He collapsed into his leather chair and immediately reached for his phone, which had been buzzing incessantly with notifications. 17 missed calls, 43 unread emails, and a text message from his assistant reminding him about the urgent authorization needed before midnight. Richard rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar throb of a stress headache building behind his eyes. The landline on his desk rang immediately, its sharp tone cutting through the quiet office like a blade. Richard glanced at the caller ID, blocked number, and hesitated for a moment before answering. In his current state, he wasn't sure he could handle another crisis. "Richard Hale speaking," he answered, his voice hoarse from hours of back-to-back conference calls. "Mr. Hale! Thank goodness I caught you." The voice on the other end was smooth, professional, with just the right amount of urgency to command attention. "This is Marcus Webb from Global Infrastructure Solutions. I've been trying to reach you all evening about the Singapore deal." Richard frowned, trying to place the name. His exhausted brain struggled to sort through the dozens of deals and contacts he juggled daily. Singapore. That rang a bell, but the details were fuzzy. "I'm sorry, Mr. Webb, but I'm having trouble placing your company. Could you refresh me on the specifics?" "Of course, sir. Completely understandable given how busy you've been." The caller's tone was patient, almost paternal. "We're the infrastructure consulting firm handling the port development project. The contract was finalized last week, and we just need your authorization for the initial payment to secure the permits before the government offices close for their holiday weekend." Richard's eyes fell on the contract lying open on his desk, the one with the yellow sticky note about the midnight deadline. His assistant must have prepared it based on earlier conversations he couldn't quite remember. The past week had been such a blur of meetings and negotiations that individual deals had started bleeding together in his memory. "The thing is, Mr. Hale," the voice continued with practiced concern, "the Singapore Maritime Authority is extremely strict about their deadlines. If we don't get this payment authorized by midnight their time, which gives us about 6 minutes, we'll lose our window for the next 3 months. The project would be dead in the water, and frankly, so would the $15 million in projected profits we discussed." $15 million. The number hit Richard like a shot of adrenaline. In his current financial situation, that kind of profit could single-handedly save his quarterly numbers and get the board off his back. He reached for the contract, squinting at the fine print through tired eyes. "I understand the urgency," Richard said, uncapping his fountain pen. "But I have to ask, $3.2 million seems like a substantial upfront payment. Is that typical for this kind of project?" "Absolutely normal, sir. Asian infrastructure projects require significant permit fees and regulatory deposits. It's all outlined in Section 7 of the contract. Plus, remember, this represents less than 20% of your projected return. The Singapore deal alone will more than justify the initial investment." Richard flipped through the pages, but the legal language seemed to swim before his exhausted eyes. He had always prided himself on reading every contract thoroughly, but tonight was different. Tonight, he was running on fumes and desperation, making decisions with a brain that felt wrapped in cotton. "Mr. Hale, I hate to pressure you, but we really are down to the wire here." The voice pressed gently. "My contact at the Maritime Authority confirmed they're shutting down the system at exactly midnight. If we miss this window..." Richard looked at his watch. 11:57 p.m. 3 minutes. The pen felt heavy in his hand as he positioned it above the signature line. Everything about this felt rushed, but then again, the biggest deals always did. He had built his company by making quick decisions and taking calculated risks. This was just another test of his business instincts. His hand trembled slightly as he brought the pen closer to the paper. The voice on the phone had gone quiet, letting the pressure of the ticking clock do its work. Richard could almost hear his heartbeat in the silence, each second bringing him closer to what could either be his salvation or his downfall. But something made him pause, a sound from outside his office that didn't quite belong in the late-night stillness. The sound that had caught Richard's attention was the soft squeak of Tia's sneakers as she moved closer to his office doorway. She had been dusting the reception area just outside, but the urgency in the CEO's voice had drawn her attention like a magnet. Something about his tone, stressed, rushed, almost desperate, reminded her of how her mother sounded when bill collectors called their apartment. Tia positioned herself just outside the glass door, pretending to clean the chrome handle while straining to hear the conversation. Her mother was busy in the far conference room, the gentle hum of her vacuum providing perfect cover for Tia's eavesdropping. Through the slightly open door, she could hear both sides of the phone conversation clearly. The man on the other end had one of those smooth, confident voices that reminded Tia of the telemarketer who had tried to sell her grandmother a once-in-a-lifetime insurance policy last month, the same policy that turned out to be a scam that nearly cost her grandmother her life savings. "Mr. Hale, I completely understand your hesitation," the voice was saying, dripping with false sympathy. "But I need you to trust me here. We've worked together before, remember? The Jakarta project? That generated $8 million in profits for your company." Tia's eyebrows shot up. She watched Richard nod slowly, though she could tell by his expression that he was struggling to remember. The caller was using a classic manipulation trick she had learned about the hard way, referencing fake shared experiences to build false trust. It had happened to her mother just 6 months ago. A man claiming to be from their electric company had called, insisting they had worked together to resolve a billing issue the previous year. He had sounded so convincing that her mother had almost given him their banking information before Tia suggested they call the company directly to verify. "The Jakarta project," Richard muttered, rubbing his forehead. "Yes, of course." But Tia could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He didn't remember any Jakarta project, and the caller was banking on his exhaustion and desperation to prevent him from questioning it too deeply. It was a psychological trick called false familiarity, and Tia had learned to recognize it from helping her mother navigate the constant stream of scammers who targeted people in their neighborhood. "Exactly," the voice continued smoothly. "And this Singapore deal will be even bigger. But Mr. Hale, we really are running out of time. The Maritime Authority system closes in. Let me check. 90 seconds. If you could just sign that authorization, I can guarantee this will be the best decision you make this year." 90 seconds. Tia's heart began to race as she watched Richard pick up his pen again, his hand hovering over the signature line. She could see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the office's cool temperature. But it was what the caller said next that made Tia's blood run cold. "And remember, sir, this is completely confidential. The Singapore government requires absolute discretion on infrastructure deals. So please don't discuss this with your legal team or financial advisors until after the contracts are signed. Any leaks could jeopardize the entire arrangement." Tia's eyes widened in recognition. That was the exact same thing the fake insurance salesman had told her grandmother. "Don't tell anyone about this special offer, it's exclusively for you." It was designed to isolate the victim, to prevent them from getting advice that might expose the scam. She watched in growing horror as Richard nodded, completely buying into the manipulation. He was successful, intelligent, and experienced, but exhaustion and desperation had made him vulnerable to the same tricks that worked on lonely elderly people and struggling families. "I understand completely," Richard said, his voice gaining conviction as the false deadline pressure mounted. "Discretion is paramount in international deals." "Precisely. Now, if you could just sign on the bottom line." Tia could see Richard's pen descending toward the paper. In 30 seconds, he would authorize a payment of $32 million to what she was now certain was a fraudulent company. She thought about her mother's reaction if she found out Tia had been eavesdropping, but she also thought about how devastated Mr. Hale would be when he discovered he had been robbed. More than that, she thought about all the people who depended on Hale Industries for their jobs. Her mother had mentioned that the company employed over 2,000 people. If Mr. Hale lost millions to a scam, those jobs could be in jeopardy. People like her mother, who worked multiple jobs just to keep food on the table, could lose everything. The caller's voice became more urgent. 30 seconds, Mr. Hale. "I'm sorry to rush you, but the system is literally about to shut down." Tia watched Richard's jaw clench with determination. He was about to sign. She could see it in his posture, in the way he gripped the pen, in the resigned acceptance on his face. He had made his decision. But Tia had made hers too. Every instinct told her to stay quiet, to mind her own business, to continue cleaning and pretend she hadn't heard anything. She was just a 12-year-old girl whose mother cleaned offices for a living. What right did she have to interfere in a multimillion-dollar business decision? But her mother had taught her something more important than staying quiet. She had taught her to stand up for what was right, even when it was scary. Especially when it was scary. As Richard's pen touched the paper, Tia took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and prepared to do something that would either save the day or get her and her mother fired. There was no more time to think, no more time to doubt. It was time to act. The pen was millimeters from the paper when Tia knocked softly on the glass door frame. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was certain everyone in the building could hear it, but she forced herself to smile as Richard looked up with surprise and mild annoyance. "I'm so sorry to bother you, Mr. Hale," Tia said, stepping into the office with the practiced politeness her mother had taught her when dealing with important people. "But my mama sent me to ask about some cleaning supplies we might have forgotten in here earlier today." Richard's hand froze, the pen suspended in midair. The voice on the phone immediately became agitated. "Mr. Hale? Mr. Hale, are you still there? We have less than 20 seconds before the system shuts down." Richard covered the phone's mouthpiece and looked at Tia with barely concealed frustration. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but I'm in the middle of a very important call. Can this wait until tomorrow?" But Tia had anticipated this response. She had watched her mother handle difficult situations countless times, and she knew that sometimes you had to be creative to get people's attention. Her eyes darted to the contract on the desk, and she made a split-second decision that could either save the day or ruin everything. "Oh wow," she said, moving closer to the desk with wide-eyed curiosity. "Is that about the Singapore port project? My social studies class just did a report on Asian shipping routes, and Singapore was one of our case studies." The lie came out so smoothly that even Tia was surprised by her own boldness. But she had learned something important from watching scammers work. Sometimes you had to fight deception with deception. Richard blinked in surprise, momentarily thrown off guard by this unexpected connection. The voice on the phone became increasingly frantic. "Mr. Hale! 10 seconds! You need to sign right now!" But Tia was just getting started. She pointed to a specific line in the contract that had been bothering her since she first saw it. "That's so interesting that they use AP/O box address. In our research, we learned that all the major shipping companies in Singapore have actual office buildings in the Marina Bay Financial Center. My teacher said you can always tell a legitimate company by whether they have a real address." Richard's eyes snapped to the line Tia was indicating. For the first time all evening, he looked at the contract with genuine focus instead of exhausted acceptance. The address was indeed just a P.O. box number in a location he couldn't immediately place. That's an interesting observation," Richard said slowly, his business instincts finally overriding his fatigue. The voice on the phone was now desperate. "Mr. Hale, please! The system is shutting down. You're going to lose this opportunity forever." But Tia wasn't finished. She had noticed something else that had been nagging at her, and now she had Richard's attention. "Also, isn't it weird that they're asking for payment on a Friday night? In our report, we learned that Singapore is like 13 hours ahead of us. So if it's almost midnight here, wouldn't it be like early Saturday afternoon there? Why would their government offices be closing on a Saturday afternoon?" The color drained from Richard's face as the simple logic of a 12-year-old girl cut through weeks of manipulation and pressure. His exhausted brain began to clear as if cold water had been splashed across it. "You're absolutely right," he whispered, setting down his pen with a shaking hand. "The time zones don't make any sense." The phone was still pressed to his ear, and he could hear the caller becoming increasingly aggressive. "Mr. Hale, what's happening over there? Who are you talking to? This deal is confidential." For the first time since answering the phone, Richard felt a surge of clarity and anger. He looked at Tia with newfound respect, realizing that this young girl had just saved him from making a catastrophic mistake. "Mr. Webb," Richard said into the phone, his voice now steady and cold, "I'm talking to someone who's apparently smarter than both of us combined. And she's just pointed out some very interesting discrepancies in your proposal." Tia beamed with pride but tried to maintain her innocent expression. She could see that Richard was finally thinking clearly, but she knew the caller would try one last desperate attempt to salvage the scam. "Mr. Hale, don't listen to whoever is there," the voice pleaded, dropping some of its smooth professionalism. This is a private business matter. You need to sign now, or you'll lose everything. But Richard was already reaching for his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Tell me, Mr. Webb, what's the weather like in Singapore right now? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice that had lost all its confident authority, what does that have to do with anything? Just curious, Richard said, his eyes scanning his computer screen. Because according to my research, Singapore is 13 hours ahead of us, just like my young friend here mentioned. Which means it's currently 12:57 p.m. on Saturday afternoon there, not midnight on Friday night. Funny how your government offices are supposedly closing at lunchtime on a weekend. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Tia could practically feel the scammer's panic radiating through the speaker. Richard's voice became deadly quiet. Who are you really, and what company do you actually work for? The line went dead. The sudden silence in the office was deafening. Richard stared at the phone in his hand as if it had just turned into a poisonous snake, while Tia stood beside his desk, her heart still racing from the adrenaline of her bold intervention. The contract that had seemed so urgent moments before now lay on the desk like evidence of a crime that had almost been committed. He hung up, Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. The reality of what had almost happened was beginning to sink in, and his face went pale as he realized how close he had come to disaster. Tia nodded solemnly. Scammers always hang up when you start asking the right questions. It happened to my neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez last month when someone tried to sell her fake Medicare supplements. Richard set the phone down with trembling hands and turned his full attention to the contract. For the first time in hours, his mind was completely clear, sharp with the kind of focus that had built his business empire. He began reading every line with the scrutiny he should have applied from the beginning. My God! He breathed, running his finger along the text. Look at this language. Global Infrastructure Solutions LLC. It sounds official, but it's completely generic. And you're right about the P.O. box. No legitimate company handling multimillion-dollar contracts would use a mail drop as their business address. Tia leaned closer, her earlier nervousness replaced by excitement at seeing her suspicions confirmed. And look at the phone number at the bottom. It doesn't have a Singapore country code. That's a US number with a 555 prefix. Those are usually fake numbers used in movies and TV shows. Richard's eyes widened as he noticed detail after detail that his exhausted brain had missed. The contract was a masterpiece of deception, professional enough to fool someone who wasn't looking carefully, but riddled with inconsistencies that became obvious under proper scrutiny. The payment terms are completely wrong too. Richard continued, his business expertise now fully engaged. No legitimate infrastructure project would require such a massive upfront payment without any performance guarantees or milestone deliverables. This is basically asking me to wire $3.2 million to a complete stranger with no recourse if they disappear. He reached for his desk phone and dialed his legal advisor's emergency number. Despite the late hour, the call was answered on the second ring. Jonathan? It's Richard. I know it's past midnight, but I need you to look at something immediately. I think I almost fell victim to a sophisticated fraud scheme. While Richard spoke with his lawyer, Tia found herself studying other documents on the desk. Her eye for detail, trained by years of helping her mother spot predatory practices from landlords and service companies, noticed several other suspicious papers that appeared to be part of the same elaborate scam. Mr. Hale, she said softly, not wanting to interrupt his call but knowing this was important. I think there might be more. Richard held up a finger, finishing his conversation with Jonathan. Yes, I'll scan everything and send it to you immediately. And Jonathan? If this is what I think it is, we need to contact the FBI in the morning. He hung up and turned to Tia with newfound respect. What did you find? Tia pointed to a stack of seemingly official correspondence. These letters look like they're from the same fake company, but they're trying to make it seem like you've been working together for months. Look at the dates, they go back 6 weeks, but the paper all looks brand new. Like someone printed them all at the same time to create a fake history. Richard examined the documents with amazement. The level of sophistication was staggering, Someone had created an entire fictional business relationship, complete with fake meeting minutes, project updates, and financial projections, all designed to make the final payment request seem legitimate. "This is incredible," Richard said, shaking his head. "They must have been planning this for months. They researched my company, my financial situation, even my personal schedule to know when I'd be most vulnerable. If you hadn't been here tonight..." The weight of what could have happened settled over both of them. $3.2 million would have vanished into an untraceable offshore account, leaving Richard's company in financial ruin and potentially destroying the livelihoods of thousands of employees. "How did you know?" Richard asked, looking at Tia with genuine curiosity. "I've been in business for 25 years, and I was completely fooled. But you saw through it immediately." Tia smiled shyly, suddenly feeling self-conscious about the attention. "My mama always says that poor people learn to spot scams because we can't afford to fall for them. When someone calls our house trying to sell us something we can't afford, or when the landlord tries to add fake fees to our rent, we have to pay attention to every detail because we don't have money to lose." Richard felt a profound sense of humility wash over him. This 12-year-old girl, whose family lived paycheck to paycheck, had just demonstrated a level of street smarts and practical intelligence that his expensive education and decades of business experience had failed to provide. "Your mother raised an incredibly smart daughter," Richard said softly. "You saved my company tonight, Tia. You saved my employees' jobs, and you probably saved my life." As the sound of Mrs. Johnson's cleaning cart approached the office, Richard quickly gathered the fraudulent documents. Tomorrow, he would contact the authorities and begin the process of tracking down the criminals who had nearly succeeded in their elaborate scheme. But tonight, he owed a debt of gratitude to a young girl who had proven that wisdom could come from the most unexpected places. The next morning, Richard Hale stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching the sun rise over the city he had nearly lost the power to protect. The fraudulent contract lay in an evidence bag on his desk, soon to be handed over to federal investigators. His legal team had confirmed what Tia had instinctively known: the scam was sophisticated, international in scope, and would have been virtually impossible to recover from once the money was transferred. He had spent the sleepless hours after Tia and her mother left replaying the events of the night, marveling at how close he had come to financial ruin and how an unexpected guardian angel had appeared in the form of a 12-year-old girl with keen eyes and a pure heart. At precisely 9 a.m., Richard's assistant buzzed his intercom. "Mr. Hale? Mrs. Johnson and her daughter are here, as you requested. Send them in immediately," Richard replied, straightening his tie and trying to calm the nervous excitement he felt about what he was planning to do. Tia and her mother entered the office looking anxious and uncertain. Mrs. Johnson had dressed in her best outfit, a simple but elegant navy dress she reserved for church and special occasions, and had spent the morning coaching Tia on proper behavior in case they were in trouble for the previous night's events. "Please sit down," Richard said warmly, gesturing to the comfortable chairs arranged in front of his desk. He had deliberately chosen this setup over the more intimidating conference table, wanting the conversation to feel personal rather than corporate. "Mr. Hale," Mrs. Johnson began nervously, "if Tia did anything inappropriate last night, I take full responsibility. She's a curious child, but she knows better than to interfere with business matters." Richard held up a gentle hand to stop her. "Mrs. Johnson, your daughter didn't do anything inappropriate. She did something extraordinary." He turned to Tia, who was sitting on the edge of her chair, her hands folded politely in her lap. "Tia, do you understand what happened last night?" Tia nodded solemnly. "You were about to give a lot of money to bad people who were trying to trick you." "That's exactly right. $3.2 million, to be precise. Money that would have bankrupted this company and cost 2,000 people their jobs." Richard paused to let the magnitude of that number sink in. "But because of your quick thinking and courage, none of that happened." Mrs. Johnson's eyes widened in shock. She had known something significant had occurred, but the full scope was just becoming clear. $3 million? She whispered. "Your daughter saved this company, Mrs. Johnson. More than that, she saved the livelihoods of every family that depends on Hale Industries for their income. Richard moved around to the front of his desk, leaning against it casually to make himself seem less intimidating. In 25 years of business, I've never encountered someone with such natural instincts for recognizing deception. He pulled out a thick folder that he had been preparing since dawn. Which is why I want to discuss Tia's future with you both. Tia looked up with curious eyes, while her mother tensed with protective concern. I've spoken with my board of directors this morning, Richard continued, and we've unanimously agreed to establish the Tia Johnson Scholarship Fund. This will cover all of Tia's educational expenses from now through college, including private tutoring if she wants it, summer programs, and eventually full tuition to any university she chooses to attend. The room fell completely silent. Mrs. Johnson's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears she was trying desperately to hold back. Tia looked back and forth between the two adults, not fully comprehending the life-changing nature of what had just been offered. Mr. Hale. Mrs. Johnson finally managed to whisper. We can't accept something like that. It's too much. With respect, Mrs. Johnson, it's not nearly enough. Your daughter saved my company millions of dollars and thousands of jobs. This scholarship represents a fraction of what she's worth to this world. Richard's voice grew passionate as he thought about the potential he saw in Tia. She has a gift for analysis, for seeing patterns that others miss, for standing up for what's right even when it's scary. Those are the qualities that change the world. He knelt down to Tia's eye level. What do you want to be when you grow up, Tia? Tia thought for a moment, then smiled with the innocent honesty that only children possess. I want to help people like my mama does, but maybe also help them with money problems so they don't get tricked by bad people. Richard grinned. That sounds like you want to be a financial crimes investigator, or maybe a lawyer who protects people from fraud. With your natural talents and a great education, you could do either of those things, or anything else you set your mind to. But there was something else Richard wanted to do. He pulled out one more document, an official letter on company letterhead. Mrs. Johnson, I'm also offering you a position as our head of facilities management. It comes with a significant salary increase, full benefits, and normal business hours so you can be home with Tia in the evenings. Now the tears Mrs. Johnson had been holding back flowed freely. This was more than she had dared to dream, not just security for her daughter's future, but dignity and stability for their present. Tia jumped up from her chair and hugged Richard around the waist, her joy pure and uninhibited. Thank you, Mr. Hale. I promise I'll study really hard and make you proud. As Richard hugged her back, he realized that he had learned something invaluable from this experience. Success wasn't just about making money or closing deals. It was about recognizing potential wherever it came from and nurturing it so it could flourish. Later that day, Richard called a company-wide meeting to publicly thank the Johnson family for their service and to announce Tia's scholarship. As he watched the thunderous applause from his employees, he knew that this story would become part of Hale Industries' legend, the night a 12-year-old girl with a sharp mind and a brave heart had saved them all. And Tia, standing beside her mother and beaming with pride, had learned something too, that being smart and brave could change not just your own life, but the lives of thousands of others. It was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her remarkable life.